All animals are creatures of habit. Habits add an element of predictability to an unpredictable world, and they are crucial for efficient use of an environment. The drawback to habit is that as the world changes, individuals must change or risk becoming obsolete.
All creatures are creatures of habit, and behavior by consequences ensures that habits are going to follow. The minute any creature gets involved in a behavior, if the consequences are positive, it increases the likelihood of the creature doing the behavior again. And so that becomes the origin of habits, culture, the culture that we're brought up in. There's incredible survival value in habit because we become familiar with a place, with how to behave in that particular place. And I think that's the reason that this dichotomy between what's familiar and what's unfamiliar is so strong, not only in people, but in all of the creatures that we've worked with. Creatures that aren't cautious of the unknown don't live long, basically. And so habits are incredibly important. The problem is simply that if we cling to habits too much, we're going to go extinct.
Just as animals encounter dilemmas, managers face their own dilemmas in attempting to adapt. They arise due to difficult choices that revolve around sticking with what they know or trying something new.
I've said to a lot of people, you don't have stewardship unless you have intimacy with that landscape. And that intimacy comes when you've ridden it and you know a place where the cows go in the fall. And you've got to go check Canyon Creek because there's going to be a few in there. Or that you know it because you know where the needle and thread grasses come out, and you want to be sure that you have your cool season grasses as part of your biodiversity on your plant side. That's what we should be promoting, is that kind of intimacy with a particular piece of the landscape, and that can't happen if we're bickering and fighting, or if we're wearing people out and they're leaving a landscape. That's the benefit that I think we've had historically of families being in one place. The downside to that, quite honestly, is families being in one place get into a routine. And, you know, it worked and it worked pretty well, so why change it? If you change it, it might not work. That's all true, but you've got to be out there on that edge looking at things that might make you more productive, things that might make you more profitable, and things that keep that system in a sense that it's building itself and not tearing itself down.
And you read in the business literature, the average lifetime of a Fortune 500 company is less than half of our lifetime. Those are the best companies in the country. And they don't survive long. Why? As the world changes around them, they're unable to cope with that kind of change, and so they go extinct. Whether you're an individual or a social group or a species, if you can't cope with change, you're going to go extinct.
People don't change unless they're forced to change. Unless something really comes and whacks you on the side of the head, you're not going to change doing what you're doing. There's got to be some impetus for you to change. And because of all the interest by outsiders in how people are managing both their private and the public lands, that's sort of the whack on the side of the head. And a lot of people are being forced to look at things differently. When I went to school, we didn't talk about riparian areas. You know, those were areas you just were sacrifice areas and you didn't deal with them. Well, now it's the main focus, and unfortunately some of the only ground that people manage. They'll just look at the riparian area instead of looking at the whole picture. And I can guarantee you that in a number of years we're going to be back out looking at the uplands saying we forgot about them, now we're going to have to go back and look at them. So looking at that whole picture. So the opportunity is there for people to change, and if they don't, someone else will come in and make them change, and it probably won't be something they're necessarily going to want to do.
We do get an influx of personnel once things aren't going so good, and I always use this to a lot of the younger folks that I help train and have an opportunity to work with them. As I say, look, we need 5 years of drought, and they really get upset with me. But I said the reason we do is that this country recovers so well with 1 year that you never have that need to change. And so I really think that adversity really leads to some change, and we in this country respond so well that we don't need it. You know, the last office I left in New Mexico, when I left, we had 65 folks that I worked with on a day in and day out on intensive grazing because the old way wasn't working. Here, I don't have a one.
Social and physical environments influence the beliefs and values of people. During the frontier days of the 1800s, values were shaped largely by the challenge of eking a living from farms and ranches. During the past century, values have been shaped by life in the city. In the process, the general population has come to embrace new lifestyles that now emphasize recreation and conservation rather than production of commodities such as livestock.
When my father or my great-grandfather came to this land, early part of this century, it had one value, and that was commodity production, either grazing or mining or forestry. And during the time of my father, we started seeing a value like recreation come on, where people were interested in the land for hunting, fishing, and etc. And lately, a third value has really shown up, the value of conservation. The society adds values to this same resource, and so the cost of that, the market price of it, is expanding greater and greater. Where the ranchers are still back here tapping into the resource value strictly with the commodity production. Our economic strategy is to tap into these broader values in a manner that is consistent. We talk about blending these values and blending products that don't impinge on other values. We don't do things that destroy our grazing abilities, and we don't graze in a manner that destroys the recreation or the conservation. So we try to do everything in moderation.
We've got to balance three things, and it doesn't matter whether you're running Red Canyon Ranch or a university or a shoe store in town. You've got to be looking at the economic side, you've got to look at the ecological setting, and the community and the culture that you live in. And those things, if you can't pass those tests with a practice that you want to employ, then you better back up and think real hard before you do it. You're gonna make mistakes. You know, we tell everybody that. One of our favorite things here at the ranch is everyone is entitled to a major screw up every year. Now, that doesn't mean you have to make it if you don't want to, but you know what? You're gonna make some screw ups. If you're learning and if you're challenging yourself, you're gonna make some mistakes. We just write that off. I mean, it's not a loss, it's just written off, and nobody's gonna get bent out of shape about it. As a consequence of that, the ability that everyone has to try things and know that if it fails, that it's not the end of the world, you're not gonna lose your job, you're not gonna be run off, liberates people's brain on the right side. And now that right brain's cranking out there, and you're getting ideas, and you're doing things, and what we're seeing is things that happen. We've found some ways to eradicate some noxious weeds. We've found some ways to deal with moving our livestock. We've found some things with ways that we can enhance and renovate meadows. We've found ways to deal with beaver and other things. And that's all because that right side of the brain is engaged and allowed to flow and do things. We're not in a box.
I had let my son-in-law take care of my little operation here back in 1976 when they were fresh in high school. He was courting my daughter. And I told him to move my cattle every third or fourth day from one paddock to the next. And I was gone for only 1 week. So he should have been in the third paddock when I came back, and he was already in the fourth and fifth one. And I told him, I said, boy, you messed up. And what actually happened, he had left my grass, instead of grazing it all the way to the ground, he had left about 2 inches of leaf on it. And instead of waiting 35 days, I came back and I grazed it in 20 days. The quality was much better. My cattle were doing better. So through a mistake, I learned a lesson.
As Mr. Gerald points out, people learn based on the consequences of their actions, and we learn best from our mistakes. Nevertheless, we are taught from an early age not to make mistakes. The tendency to explore new ways of managing that may or may not pay off is higher when old ways of doing business no longer work. Necessity is the mother of invention. In the process, we often are able to learn from peers who already have ventured into the unknown.
Watching one's own peers is a good way to get started. We have a lot of pasture walks and things where people can go out and see what other folks are doing. Unfortunately, some people are still caught in the old way, and they will look at their neighbors and say, that's not for me. And they'll say that for 3 or 4 or 5 years before they finally change their mind and say, well, maybe that's something I should try. But generally they think that the neighbor who tries the pasture is going to go out of business. For some reason there is a thought that that's the last thing you do before you go out of business. And a lot of these farms aren't going out of business. They're more productive and more profitable than they were. A farmer has to change their mind before they'll change their management. And that's been taking quite some time to get them to do that. They've been convinced by a lot of different people in different places that the cow belongs in the barn and you should bring the feed to them, and that's how you'll maximize your profits. But it's just not true for many of the farms that we work with, especially the mid-sized farms. You know, the herd size in New York State, average size of a herd is only about 70 cows. So in those kind of operations, the pasture really does improve their net profit if they do a good job of management. So, you know, right off the bat, we have people saying, well, they'll never work. You can't put cows out and let them harvest their own feed. They'll lose production, or the herd is too big, and all sorts of reasons why they don't want to do it. So it's kind of a hand-holding exercise to get these folks to recognize that they're not the first one, and there's lots of people that are successful. So that, you know, from the people side or person side, getting them to change their mind to do it is the first thing. And then as far as the animal is concerned, it gets really difficult to have to train a cow that's been in the barn its whole entire life, having feed brought to it, that the feed is actually in the pasture. And when they go out the barn door to find their own feed, it becomes an exercise in a lot of cows standing at the gate mooing and wanting to come back in the barn and be fed in confinement again. So there is a transition period that they have to go through.
In the future in ranching, we're going to see a big difference. You're seeing right now some really good managers come out with innovative ideas who are able to manage in situations that other ranchers would find intolerable. Things where a lot of conflict on Forest Service permits and these sort of things. There's a new type of manager that can go in and solve these conflicts and get this done and remove and refine that natural resource into a product that can be sold in an efficient manner. And what's important with animal behavior in this is again, it's a mental thing much more than it is infrastructure. So if you go to another ranch, you take it with you very easily. It's very portable, and it's very valuable. I think these are some of the solutions that are going to keep ranching in business in the next century.
What's the value of this knowledge? Knowledge about plants and how they behave, knowledge about herbivores and how they behave. I think several things happen as a person starts to acquire this knowledge. First, one's views become circular rather than linear. You start to see all these relationships as part of a system that's incredibly dynamic across time and across space as well. Your solutions to problems then start to become very holistic. Rather than simply dealing with symptoms, you start to deal with the whole system and the processes that underlie the evolution of that system. And so you can start to think in really holistic ways about the relationship of the parts of that system to the whole, and also the relationship of the whole to the parts. And so it becomes not a reductionist, holist sort of dichotomy or argument. It becomes realizing the interrelationship of the parts, how they create the whole, how the whole in turn interacts to recreate the parts, and you see it as an ongoing dynamic. The solutions to the problems you encounter then become broad and all-encompassing, and they start to consider everything from soils to plants to water to herbivores to people, and the interrelationships among all of those things, that we're all connected as a part of this whole that's evolving over time. If we ever hope to manage systems sustainably, we've got to go in that direction. We can't simply focus on linear cause and effect kind of explanations for things. We have to start looking at the system and the interrelationships of all the facets within that system.